At the foot of the mountains lies a clean, calm lake with clear water, where, as expected, there's fish. Basically, just your regular lake. But this is a totally different story. It's not connected to any rivers, and it's way too far from the ocean. You might have seen places like this, big holes or depressions that turn into ponds after heavy rains. Still, even in these ponds, fish show up from somewhere, even if they're high up in the mountains. And there are a few explanations for that, but first, coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. In fact, it's the smaller lakes with a surface area under 1,000 square feet that make up the bulk of the world's freshwater ecosystems. And many of these lakes are found in remote, often mountainous areas with no regular inflow or outflow. Still, most of them have fish. But those fish had to get there somehow. Scientists point to 3 possible ways. And the first one is directly linked to precipitation. When heavy rains fall, water bodies, even isolated ones, can overflow, spill beyond their edges, and the flowing water carries the inhabitants of one pond to a new home. Something vaguely familiar happened in Brazil back in 2019. Back then, people suddenly found a whale in the jungle, a real humpback whale, 26 feet long and 20 feet wide. It was discovered about 50 feet from the Atlantic Ocean, on an island not far from the Amazon River mouth. Scientists studying the case believe the whale had been swimming near the shore, and a strong tide, which was quite intense those days, picked it up and tossed it inland into the mangroves. So you see what I mean, right? Water is perfectly capable of dragging even a humpback whale from one place to another, let alone some tiny fish. But the lake I mentioned in the beginning is up on top of a mountain, way higher than any other body of water around. So the flood theory doesn't really work. I mean, I've never heard a story about water shoving someone up a mountain, but what about the other way? I mean, maybe the fish were tossed down from above. Back in 2021, for example, wildlife officers in Utah dropped thousands of fish from a plane into 200 high-altitude lakes all over the state. And the state's been doing this kind of thing since way back in 1956. And when I say they drop fish from planes, I mean exactly that. The fish shoot out from the bottom of the plane along with a spray of water, fly through the air, and land in the lake. Most often, various species of salmonids such as splake or Arctic grayling are landed this way, all to help restock the lakes. This method might seem a bit harsh on the baby fish since they're only 1 to 3 inches long at the time. That is, the fish are really light and the wind carries them super gently, almost like falling leaves. After each drop, about 95% of the fish survive, and considering one plane can release up to 35,000 of them, that's a pretty hefty number. By the way, before Utah authorities started using planes, people and horses used to haul fish on foot to remote mountain lakes. That trip was way more stressful for the fish than an airdrop, but stocking the lakes is essential, otherwise heavy fishing would wipe out every single one of them. These days, fish are first raised in hatcheries, and most of them come out sterile right away to avoid sudden population booms and keep the impact on local species to a minimum. The drop itself is called aerial fish stocking, and they can do it several times a year, usually starting in July. In many cases, fish are introduced deliberately because people want to be able to catch a certain species outside its natural range. For example, in the late 19th century, the U.S. Fish Commission made a concerted effort to introduce carp as a commercial fish into the waters of the western United States. Now you can find it in lakes and reservoirs all over the region. Some even consider it invasive. But sometimes stocking happens by accident, or at least without the approval of the authorities, like when people let their aquarium fish go or dump buckets of bait into the wild. Still, I couldn't find any mention of fish ever being tossed into our mountain lake. And here's the thing. Fish aren't all the same. Some of them can actually cross land, on foot. Well, more like wriggling, really. For example, armored catfish do this, and they live in Central and South America. They stay in isolated bodies of water, and if food or any other resource runs out there, the catfish can crawl onto land to find a new home. The trip can last for hours. But even these fish have their limits and a hard deadline after which being out of the water will just kill them. Luckily, evolution gave these fish special receptors along their bodies that can detect compounds signaling the proximity and quality of water. And in general, nature made these fish unique with a special body structure to move quickly on land. Well, quickly for a fish. The way they move is so unusual that scientists had to come up with a new word for it: ruffling. It's nothing like any kind of ground movement you know. Fish swim using their tail, which swings more sharply to one side than the other. You can compare it to swinging on a swing set, but instead of going higher and higher, the catfish crawls forward at about 3 feet per second. That's slow for a human, but for fish, it's almost flash-level speed. There are actually several species that can move like this, and some fish feel so at home on land that visiting it is part of their daily routine. This shopping mall in Florida is a few miles from the nearest river, but in its parking lot, where there are puddles all around, you can often spot a bunch of catfish. They're alive, well, and perfectly comfortable crawling on the wet asphalt because that's where you can find plenty of tasty worms after the rain. And once the worms are gathered, the fish just dive into the storm drain like they were never there. Scientists assume that these amphibious fish rely not only on special receptors, but also on vision, which needs some adjustments to function in air. In other words, the refractive index of air definitely differs from water. So we humans with eyes made for air see blurry underwater. Colors and shapes remain, but telling specific objects apart gets tough. For fish, it's mostly the other way around. They likely can spot key visual hints outside the water, like reflections, colors, shapes that could help them locate a new water source or at least stay out of harm's way. There's also the inner ear, which can help amphibious fish find their way on land and make their way down a slope, because a slope usually means a low area, and there might be water in the low spot. And although the idea that fish climbed up a mountain themselves sounds crazy and interesting, the lake up there is inhabited by boring trout that can't walk. Besides, they wouldn't survive on land for more than a few minutes, so this option just doesn't work. But there are others too. Many animals move constantly between bodies of water. They've been doing it for thousands of years and will keep doing it as long as those bodies of water don't disappear. Among these animals are birds, and some of them specialize in eating fish eggs. Some eggs, in turn, avoid being digested and come out, so to speak, the other way through the bird unharmed. That way, birds can help spread fish in isolated waters. The hypothesis of such spread was actually proposed back in the century before last, and one of its supporters was Charles Darwin himself. The main idea was that fish eggs could hitch a ride on birds as passengers, but there were problems with the evidence. A systematic review done in Switzerland in 2018 showed there's actually no proof that this really happened. One method accepted as fact for certain fish was that their eggs traveled through birds' digestive systems and, once outside, remained alive and hatched into fish larvae. This is a standard seed-spreading method for many plants, and scientists have recorded it repeatedly. But seeds are one thing, and roe is quite another. In 2019, researchers found out that at least one fish species, the killifish, can be dispersed by Coscoroba swans. Those are birds from the duck family, but these fish have some adaptations that help them survive in the gut. It's known that killifish enter diapause, a kind of suspended animation when the environment gets unfavorable. This usually happens during periodic droughts. The fish have also developed a special chorionic membrane that protects the eggs from low oxygen levels, high salinity, or drying out. But most fish eggs don't have that kind of membrane. Can they survive the rough trip through birds' guts? Turns out they can. In 2020, a study was published showing results from an experiment that showed fish roe or embryos can survive inside water birds' intestines. So the percentage of roe that make it through and hatch is low, just 0.2%, but water birds eat a massive amount of roe, so even that tiny survival rate is more than enough for fish to move to a new body of water. Basically, even fish roe without special protective features can get spread around by birds. It doesn't even need to get inside the bird, because the roe can survive for a few hours out of water. For example, when water birds fly to lakes to feed, fish roe can stick to their feathers, and then a few minutes or hours of flying and a new place to call home. Something like that happened deep in the United Arab Emirates, where, right among the sand dunes, a lake showed up recently. Well, not exactly recently, less than 20 years back. It looks like a mirage. The edge of the water meets the sand directly, thin reeds in the middle of the lake swaying in the wind. All thanks to the desalination plant that sits right on the Persian Gulf coast, takes in salty water and makes it drinkable and usable. Then this water gets pumped 149 miles inland to the city of Al Ain, where the locals use it, and after that it goes down the drain. Next, it ends up at a treatment facility where it gets cleaned up and brought back to the city. This water's used to water parks, gardens, and so on, and at that point it seeps into the groundwater. That's how it shows up in the desert not far from the city, slowly soaking its way up. The water is already clean, so fish live in the lake. They got there on their own. Their eggs stuck to the legs of herons that flew from one body of water to another across the desert. And since the Abu Dhabi Environment Agency has recorded around 130 species of water birds at Lake Zakir and Al Ain, those eggs definitely had plenty to choose from. So yeah, that's most likely how the fish ended up in our lake on top of the mountain, just as stowaways. But that's not all the ways I've discovered. Come on, it'd be weird not to share the rest with you. So yeah, sometimes fish end up in an isolated lake back when it wasn't isolated yet and just lie low, waiting for their moment. For instance, during the late Pliocene and Pleistocene, that is about 2 to 1.5 million years ago, the western part of North America had a much wetter climate. Back then, a lot of land was covered by massive lakes. But gradually, the climate got drier and those giant lakes shrank and broke into smaller ones, so the same fish ended up stuck in little water bodies and eventually evolved into different species. This doesn't just happen in North America. For example, there's Lake Thingvallavatn in Iceland, home to 3 out of 5 freshwater fish species found in Iceland: brown trout, Arctic char, and 3-spined stickleback. Scientists believe these fish became isolated in the lake after the last ice age, when the terrain changed at the lake's southern tip. So what's the takeaway? Even though there are a few possible ways fish could end up in isolated lakes, a lot of different factors have to line up for it to actually happen, especially when the lakes are up in the mountains. So many lakes were never stocked on purpose, and that's actually a good thing, because when people do stock lakes artificially, it can lead to pretty bad outcomes. High mountain lakes are usually cut off from lower streams by natural barriers that keep fish from getting in on their own. Originally, these lakes had no fish, though many of them have had non-native species introduced, mostly trout, and more recently minnows that anglers use for bait. Actually, people have been stocking them for quite a while. For example, the first introductions in the Alps happened in the late 1500s. In the Pyrenees, it started even earlier, at least back in the Middle Ages, but most of the stocking kicked off in the 19th century, and then again in the second half of the 20th century. But no matter what century it happens in, the new fish always behave the same way. They end up in a body of water where there were no fish before and start devouring everything like crazy. Naturally, that brings about profound ecological changes, since fish take up a link in the food chain that never existed in that water before. And then from those high mountain lakes, fish can colonize otherwise unreachable aquatic habitats downstream, often spreading their ecological impact across the whole basin. Which means, there too, they start munching on everything actively, reshaping ecosystems to suit themselves, and wiping out local species that aren't ready for that kind of aggressive competition and even more aggressive predation. Apparently, that's why people are now starting to think something needs to be done. In different mountainous regions around the world, there have been restoration projects aimed at bringing lakes back to their natural state, the kind that doesn't include fish. In a number of conservation projects in the US, Canada, and Europe, mechanical removal methods have already been used. Mostly the fish were taken out using intense gill netting and electrofishing. After that, the lakes were checked regularly, and it looks like no more fish have been getting in. And I think that's for the best. And you owe me a like. See you later.